Hello and welcome to Newsclick. Today we have with us D. Raghunandan, who is a part of Newsclick, Delhi Science Forum, and also on the government's Low Carbon Committee on Climate Change. Raghu, the IPCC's report has come out, the fifth report. Could you tell us viewers, what is IPCC all about? What does it is supposed to be doing? What is its role? What are these reports for?
Very briefly, the IPCC is a scientific body put together under the aegis of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, initially put together by the UN Environment Programme and the World Meteorological Organization to assist the UNFCCC in arriving at a science-based decisions on how to control climate change. So it's a body that brings together researchers from around the world to develop what I consider to be the broadest possible consensus of scientific opinion, because not only do more than 2,000 researchers from different countries sit together and look at different subjects and what's happening, but they also then send their conclusions out to reviewers who then send in their comments. This report, for example, has received more than 55,000 comments from reviewers. It includes information collected from peer-reviewed journals and publications, which could be more than 15,000 in number.
Essentially, it is the scientific community concerned with climate change which has come together, constituted under UNFCCC.
That's right.
So that's basically
what
IPCC.
Yes.
This committee.
That's basically what IPCC is, and it publishes roughly once in 6 years an assessment of what is happening with climate change.
So this is the fifth assessment.
And this is the fifth assessment report. The previous one came out in 2007, about 2 years before the Copenhagen summit.
What happens with the IPCC report? Who is supposed to be the body which looks into the what the IPCC is saying? And obviously, the scientific community can only say what is happening. It cannot prescribe what should be the actions that the countries have to take.
The advantage with the IPCC report is that because it is constituted under the UN Framework Convention, the IPCC report is drawn together by scientists, but the summary for policy makers, which is released in each of the 3 sections of the assessment reports. The first one on the science basis for climate change, the second one on impacts of climate change, and the third one on mitigation strategies to deal with this. Each of these 3 big reports has a summary for policy makers. And this summary for policy makers, which is about 40 pages long, is actually vetted by governments of the world, the parties to the UN Framework Convention, who go through it as usual, line by line, word by word. So in a sense, this is not only a scientific report, but it's a science report which has been endorsed by governments of the world. And therefore, these governments, when they go to the UN Framework Convention and their summits, are in a sense bound by these science findings.
The IPCC has been giving a number of reports. Now, to the UNFCCC, does all the countries of the globe, which are basically the large ones, which really determine the climate, are all of them a part of the UNFCCC?
Yes.
At the moment, all countries are part of FCC. Yes. Now, what is the recommendation of the report and how has it been received internationally and the past by governments? Let's discuss what in the this report has to say, which is different from the earlier ones.
Yeah. In the first place, this report has been anticipated to indicate what has happened since the previous report. And that's significant because it was the previous report which really, in some sense, set the cat among the pigeons for climate change 2 years before Copenhagen, brought a very sharp focus to the problem of climate change and said that the globe was very close to the tipping point beyond which could be runaway climate change, and prescribed very sharp reductions of emissions by the developed countries if this problem has to be solved. And that is what then set a very urgent agenda before countries of the world. There was the Bali conference in 2007, which said we must find a solution to this within 2 years at Copenhagen. However, as we know, scientists came to an agreement to a far greater extent than governments of the world, and Copenhagen did not produce the results. And this report was therefore being awaited to see how far the problem had advanced or not since the previous report. Now, in substance, what this fifth assessment report, the first working group, which pertains to the science of climate change, what that has essentially told us is three things. There has been, of course, much misleading reporting in the press, which is not surprising. It always happens before every IPCC report, but we'll come to that. So the three major findings of this report are, first, that climate change is proceeding apace. It's rapidly escalating. We are getting even closer to the tipping point than we were
6 years back.
6 years back, and that if this problem has to be checked, immediate, urgent and severe action is called for in this. The second aspect is the certainty of anthropogenic or human-induced climate change has been reinforced or underlined by IPCC. You will recall that in the third assessment report, which is in 2001, scientists had said they were 70% certain that climate change was man-made.
Anthropogenic.
In 2007, they revised this to 90% certainty. This report has gone up to 95% certainty. Now, in scientific parlance, those of us who deal with science will know, very few things can be said with 100% certainty. So, a 95% certainty is as good as being absolutely certain. So, that's the second major finding. Then there are some very interesting scientific findings which this report had made, and if you like, I will recount those. The first of them is that this report for the first time talks of not the annual flows or annual emissions emitted by different countries. It talks about cumulative emissions of greenhouse gases through an entire period, and underlines and emphasizes the fact that it is cumulative emissions which accumulate in the atmosphere which ultimately determine climate change. So therefore, that is what we should be targeting rather than annual flows of emissions.
Basically said climate change or temperature change is related to the total carbon emissions in the atmosphere.
And this report for the first time therefore talks in terms of carbon budgets. One may therefore anticipate that working group 3, which will prescribe mitigation targets, is likely to also prescribe those in terms of carbon budgets rather than in terms of annual flows.
Raghu, just as an aside, we had from Delhi Science Forum, we had built a model on carbon budgets. Right. So it seems that the IPCC has moved closer to what we were postulating at the time.
Part of our basis for doing this was also the fact that internationally the scientific community was veering around to this idea of looking at accumulated carbon in the atmosphere rather than in other. The second, I thought, very interesting thing that the fifth assessment report has come out with is saying that there has perhaps been a little overemphasis in looking at temperature rise as the key indicator for
surface temperature
rise as the key indicator for climate change. And you know that even globally, the target is always spoken in terms of what do we need to do in order to keep temperature rise to within 2 degrees centigrade.
That's a surface temperature, average surface temperature increase of the Earth.
The Earth. Now, what this report says is that we should not be so obsessed about average surface temperature as the key indicator. This is one among other key indicators of climate change, and this report speaks of sea level rise and sea temperatures as being perhaps an even more reliable indicator. For example, in the controversy that rose around this, there was a lot of talk about global temperatures having not warmed as much as expected or having slowed down, etc. This report points out that sea level rise and sea temperatures have shown a consistently upward trend without any of these ups and downs that we are used to with regard to surface temperatures. So that's another very interesting.
Also, I think the amount of snow cover, the glacial melt, the Greenland ice,
That's right.
and all
That's
that
right.
has also been
That's right. It's also been talked about
as
quite
a measure of global warming.
That's right. The third thing which this report talks about is that although there are known to be other non-carbon dioxide based climate forces like methane or fluorocarbons, NOx, nitrous oxides, etc., and they are important, this report says the key determinant to climate change is carbon dioxide.
That's the one which is changing.
And that is what is really causing the change, and therefore that's what requires to be. So I think there are, even in terms of the science, some very key findings of this which mark it out from previous ones, and to my mind shows a growing sophistication of the understanding of climate change, of the science of climate change, and a growing maturity of the scientific understanding and predictions. And in fact, if you look back from the first assessment report to now, you see a remarkable consistency and a progressive upgradation of the knowledge and increasing sophistication of this scientific understanding.
Also a focus on key parameters.
That's right. And that indicates this improvement in our own understanding of the science.
Now, you had raised earlier about what has been the campaign in the media, particularly saying there has been a slowdown and so on. Right. Now, what is this campaign all about, and who are the ones who are doing it?
This campaign is not atypical. This happens every time an assessment report is going to come out. You get a group of people who, funnily enough, all seem to be saying exactly the same thing. Now, without wanting to subscribe to conspiracy theories, it seems odd that the same criticisms are leveled by the same bunch of people almost every time. So it seems
quite uniformly
across the globe. So it seems to me fairly clear that there are a set of people whose goal is to throw doubt on the science and therefore to throw doubt on climate change itself. They are what you would otherwise call climate change deniers. And their objective of their exercise is to do this. You'll remember last time there was this controversy about the Himalayan glaciers melting, the leaks of some mails from the UK and so on. This time there were three major controversies that rose. The first said global warming has not proceeded linearly upward, that in fact the last decade has seen a slowing down of the rate of global warming. This report actually says nothing of the kind. The report only says that in the 12-year period from 1998 till 2010, that 12-year period shows a slight decline in the warming rate compared to the previous decade. But the report itself points out this is because you use 1998 as a starting year. If you had used 2000, it would have shown a different trend, because 98 was an anomalous year caused by severe El Nino effect. So if you choose a different rate, results would have been different. Second thing the report also says is, if you choose 50-year intervals, it shows a very clear progression of warming rather than 10-year intervals. And the report also stresses that the last decade, 2000 to 2010 or 2001 to 2011, have been again the warmest 10 years that humankind has ever known. That is one. The second was pertaining to the report. In one part, this is maybe a little technical, but the report in one part speaks of the range of temperature rise that could happen till the end of this century, and goes from 1.5 up to 4.5 rather than as earlier 2 degrees to above. And the report itself clarifies this, that this is no major or big revision. It just shows a wider assessment that we are giving to the possibility of where temperatures could rise. But the report also points out that the lower range of 1.5 is possible only if very stringent action on mitigation were taken, which is what the climate deniers are campaigning against or don't want. So the bulk of it is these are very almost deliberately misleading statements, and they come from the usual suspects. Fox News, the Heritage Foundation, the Liberty Institute, the extreme right-wing conservative foundations and think tanks in the US and the media, the Daily Mail in the UK, which has been at the head of it. And I was very surprised to note that this time the Hindu in India also gave front page and op-ed page huge coverage to precisely these kinds of campaigns written based on a leaked IPCC report.
You know, Raghu, this is one of the interesting things that happen. If you leak the report, supposedly,
yes,
and write, people forget what has actually been reported
exactly
later.
and only remember the leak.
Only remember that this is supposedly what the report is supposed to have said. But interestingly, you have not covered one of the key organizations which has been involved in this climate change denial movement, which is the Koch brothers.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of money which they have actually put into all these foundations. And today it has come out that in fact they funneled this quite secretively. It was not public. Only recently it has been made public. And they have also helped in getting a lot of money from the fossil fuel organizations.
That's right.
Who are also a part of this whole climate change
and
denial.
who have been the oldest funders of the climate deniers.
But they used it in order to really siphon off the money into subterranean channels, which would not be visible. And Koch brothers have been one of the key funders of this. This is something which has come out 3 months back. So effectively, it seems on one side we have scientific community which have been looking at this. On the other side, we have definitely vested interests, as we would call them, who have an interest in not taking government taking action because it harms their profit. So this is really the conflict.
And what I found particularly interesting this time around in the 5th report was that the climate deniers used the science of the report itself to question the science. They were all quoting from the IPCC report to say, see, therefore we are saying that the report says global warming is not proceeding as fast. Of course, they were misquoting the report, but they were using the report, whereas in the past it has usually been the IPCC says this, but so and so says that, and others say this. This time they are using the report itself to attack the report.
So in some sense a victory for IPCC.
I think so. I think it gives more credibility to the science.
You now have to quote scientists to debunk science, even if the scientists are saying the opposite of what the deniers are saying. So all this, of course, is a dress rehearsal, if you will, for the UNFCCC to meet and take action. When is that supposed to be?
Of course, you have a summit coming up in November this year in Warsaw, which is not likely to do anything significant, because we all know that bilaterally and multilaterally discussions between the major players in this, the large developed countries, the large developing countries, is really getting nowhere. And they haven't made any breakthroughs which you need in order to be able to reach a solution. The denouement is supposed to come end of 2015. That's the new deadline that has been set. But then we've seen such deadlines before. Bali set the deadline for 2009 in Copenhagen. Durban has set the deadline for end 2015 to arrive at a solution which will come into effect in 2020. Unless there is some major consensus or breakthrough, that has not yet happened. We will have to wait and see what the IPCC's Working Group 3 report, which is going to prescribe mitigation targets, says. And that is targeted for next year, just before Paris. Whether that is going to set the cat among the pigeons or not is what remains to be seen. The scientific consensus is certainly growing stronger. The question is, are we going to see a political consensus around it or not?
Raghu, we are held to hostage to climate change negotiations failing effectively because the US is not on board. And the US is held hostage to the Tea Party and 30, 40 odd congressmen who today have stalled the US budget itself, the debt ceiling. So we really held hostage by 40 congressmen in the United States, the entire climate change treaties. That's really the situation today.
The million-dollar question to me is, if the Europeans and the other developed countries break away from this US-centric logic which is driving the climate negotiations, then one might just be in a position to say, forget the United States, let all the other countries get together and arrive at a solution. Let's not forget, the Kyoto Protocol was signed and entered into force without the United States.
That's really a hard call to do.
And that is what maybe it will come to in Paris. Because short of that, as you say, with 40 Tea Party senators and congressmen holding up any US action on that, you're left to the US taking voluntary action and the rest of the developed countries taking binding action.
Thank you very much. We'll watch climate change negotiations because that's really the next item on the board. And once this report is there, the action really shifts to the policymakers. Thank you very much, Raghu. We'll meet again to discuss climate change as the action develops. Thank you.
Thank you.